Hello and welcome back to the Surfer's Library, proudly presented by Hillsborough Surf Club. I'm Billy Jack, your guide through the pages of surf history, culture, and legends. Well, I hope you're in the mood for a longer story today. Today's episode will be part one of a two-part series in which I'll be reading from Matt Warshaw's book, The History of Surfing. Specifically, Chapter 3, Malibu Swing, 1945 to late 1950s. I really hope that you're going to enjoy it and that you'll come back for part two. Chapter 3, Malibu Swing, 1945 to late 1950s. In late 1946, John Doc Ball, the amiable, round-faced founder of the Palos Verdes Surf Club, published California Surf Riders, one of the sport's first books. Just back from his wartime posting as a Coast Guard dentist, Ball threw himself into this friendly vanity project, producing 510 copies of the faux leather-bound book, which Ball sold himself, mostly to his surf buddies up and down the coast, charging a stiff $7.25 for each slender 118-page volume. At the time, Ball and Tom Blake were the sport's two top photographers in a field that consisted of just 3 or 4 other photo hobbyists. While Ball shot the occasional beach scene, candid, or portrait, his signature work was done from the water at Palos Verdes Cove. Ball would place his blocky Graflex D-Series camera inside an elaborate hinged and collapsed rubber-sealed pinewood housing of his own design, carefully balance the box on the deck of his board, and then paddle through the channel adjacent to the break and wait. When a surfer approached, Ball lifted the box up by its brass handle, flipped open a small round wooden portal covering the lens, took the shot, and quickly snapped the portal closed before a rogue drop of water could splash into the camera. In 1944, National Geographic published Surfboarders Capture California, an 8-page, black-and-white portfolio of Ball's work. And because the sport was at that point deep into its wartime state of suspended animation, the photos all looked snappy and new. California Surf Riders, on the other hand, published just 2 years later, had a distinct air of nostalgia from the moment that it came off the presses. Nearly all of the 150 images were taken before the war, for one thing. Also, Ball's photo captions were often recollective, even wistful, as he described the good old days at the Cove and harkened back to, among other events, the 1940 Pacific Coast Surf Riding Championships and the big Thanksgiving Day swell of 1937. But it was more than that. Within a year after VJ Day, surfing had entered one of its great periods of change, and the nation as a whole, glad to be distancing itself from war and depression, now had its gaze excitedly pointed towards the future. California Surf Riders not only asked readers to look back, it depicted a sport that in many respects no longer existed. Surf clubs, matching team jackets, the Pacific Coast Championships, jetty surf at Corona del Mar, headstands, hollow boards, diaper-like woolen surf trunks, Long Beach flood control. By 1947, when California surfers first got a look at Ball's book, these were all gone, or nearly so. The not-so-quiet American. Before World War II, surfing lived in the reflected light of the tropics, with Duke Kahanamoku's noble dark-eyed visage shining godlike from on high. Surfers and lifeguards were one and the same in Australia, or close associates in America, and the sport in general was lightly spritzed in heroism. After the war, surfing began its long march to the near and far corners of industry and media, and it became the cool new activity of choice for droves of revved-up bushy blonde suburban Southern California teenagers. It traveled with pandemic speed north to Santa Cruz, east to the Atlantic seaboard, further east to Biarritz and Newquay, and south to Lima, Rio, and Durban. Surfing had in fact already been introduced to many of these places, but the post-war style of surfing, the Southern California style, with trunks worn low on the hips, and an often shouted litany of stoking new words and phrases, and a fervor not just to ride the waves, but to be known as a wave rider, and to do so in a way that might piss off non-surfers, this was new. Surfers already had a history of distancing themselves from mainstream society. Depression-era masters like Tom Blake, Whitey Harrison, and Pete Peterson had done exactly that. The trend intensified after the war. In the hands of California youth, surfing wasn't so much a refuge from society as an alternative universe. And because California during those crucial post-war years was also birthing modern American pop culture, that alternate universe was in short order broadcast around the globe. Other cultural forces were at work too. California was central to the emergence of America's post-war suburban middle class. The state's thriving industrial base, powered by big-ticket Pentagon defense contracts, which spurred a wave of military-supported aerospace companies, meant that it had plenty of good jobs. California newcomers arrived in droves. 1.4 million arrived in Los Angeles County alone during the 1940s, and almost 2 million more came in the 1950s. Many of the newcomers were former GIs who'd trained at Pendleton or El Toro during the war and couldn't wait to return in peacetime. In the early 1950s, Los Angeles County became the nation's most populated county, breezing past Illinois' Cook County, while Orange County and San Diego County were soon in the top 5. Fires, earthquakes, race riots, locally bred colts and quacks, nothing could stop the migration to Southern California. Suburban housing tracts multiplied by the hundreds across Southern California's interior, each one paving over a few acres of orange, lemon, or walnut groves. A massive new regional freeway system fanned out to connect dozens of just incorporated and invitingly named cities: Garden Grove, Lakewood, Thousand Oaks. These sleek, multi-lane highways provided easy access to Highway 1, which in turn linked every California surf break from Dana Point up to Huntington Pier in Malibu, and then way north past Steamer Lane in Santa Cruz, and beyond to San Francisco into surfing's great west coast unknown. Right away, just from the aerospace engineers looking for something to do on the weekends, there was a bump in the number of Southern California wave riders. In addition, this was the beating heart of America's entertainment industry, and the region had in large part already staked its reputation on celebrity and glamour. Los Angeles was a leader in radio, home to Hollywood and the American movie industry, and in the 1950s it would claim television as well. TV ownership nationwide went from 10,000 sets in 1946 to 5 million in 1950, and network coverage of Pasadena's annual New Year's Day Rose Parade taunted America's frostbound states with the Southern California typical midwinter balminess. This alone convinced a few 100,000 people each year to move west. Glamour here had its own unique palette. No place else looked like Southern California, and the hypersaturated Technicolor film that became a Hollywood standard in the early 1950s was the perfect media analog to a landscape that could be similarly brilliant and unnatural: the turquoise blue swimming pools and water-sucking green lawns. Even the brilliant sunsets that so often brought a tranquil end to the surfer's day at the beach owed much of their color and vividness to the abiding stratum of oxidizing smog that filled the Los Angeles basin. The electric-powered red car train system that had transported George Freeth so cheaply and efficiently between Redondo Beach and Venice Beach prior to World War I had been dismantled by the mid-50s, and Los Angeles quickly became the runaway national leader in both car ownership and air pollution. Meanwhile, Southern California's celebrity culture made room for surfing. After the Ringe family was forced to sell parts of their enormous Malibu ranch, Hollywood quickly established a beachfront bedroom community in what was called the Malibu Colony. Former child star Jackie Coogan, tough guy character actor Richard Jekyll, Rat Packer in the Making Peter Lawford, and a few other respectable B-listers bought surfboards and often walked down to the point to ride and socialize with the Malibu regulars. Santa Monica surf hunk Tommy Zahn dated a blonde divorcee named Norma Doherty in 1947, just months before she signed a contract with 20th Century Fox and changed her name to Marilyn Monroe. "I was 22, and I guess she was 20, Zahn later recalled. "I used to take her surfing at Malibu, tandem surfing, in the dead of winter, and it didn't faze her a bit. She was very good in the water, very robust." Other young news-making females were out there too. Among California Governor Earl Warren's brood of handsome and vivacious children, his stunning blue-eyed daughter Nina Honey Bear Warren dated surfers and became a summer regular at Malibu. Finally, it was Southern California that invented the cult of the teenager. The monster of demography known as the baby boom wouldn't make its presence felt in the lineup until the late 1950s, but California was already the national bellwether state for just about everything young and new. Disneyland had just opened. 17 sold more copies here than anywhere else. A new galaxy of West Coast hot rod and motorcycle clubs had come into existence, and the Friday night cruising was endless on Van Nuys Boulevard and 100 other Main Street drags from Bakersfield to Chula Vista. Surfing after the war could survive pretty much anywhere, but only Southern California could launch it into a national, then international craze. Smart, fast, and mean, Bob Simmons reinvents the surfboard. Surfboard design rocketed forward in the post-war years. Though it was a group effort, Bob Simmons, a knobby, misanthropic engineer from Pasadena, was the era's leading figure. Simmons was strange, brilliant, experimental, permanently ungroomed, and often angry. He once answered some bullying by a group of Palos Verde Cove locals by splitting open the decks of their hollow boards with an axe. He died by surfing misadventure at a young age, which secured his place in the top rank of the boardmakers' pantheon. After a bicycle accident as a teenager, Simmons' left elbow was fused at a 90-degree angle, which left him unfit for military service. A Caltech dropout, Simmons nonetheless found work during the war as a mathematician with Douglas Aircraft, where he impressed and spooked coworkers with his flat-effect recall for numbers and formulae. Older brother Edward, a Caltech grad who remained in Pasadena until his death at age 93, was equally bright and eccentric. The stress gauge device he created earned honors from the New York Academy of Sciences, and in his senior years he became locally famous for conducting his daily business, lucid as ever, wearing tights, dance slippers, and a tutu. Simmons was 20 when he learned to surf in 1939 on a borrowed Tom Blake hollowboard. He hopped freight trains to get from Pasadena to the beach. Later, he roamed Highway 1 looking for waves in a gutted primer gray 37 Ford Tudor sedan provisioned with a Boy Scout bedroll, canned soybeans, bagged oranges, rolled up bathymetric charts, and coastal maps, a few porn magazines, and a set of homemade boomerangs. Surfing was an empirical pursuit for Simmons. He never daydreamed about Waikiki or strummed a ukulele or wore a Hawaiian shirt. The Polynesian romance of the sport just didn't register with Simmons, and while he quickly developed into a technically adept surfer, he did so with an aggressive lack of wave riding style and artistry. Schoolboys ruled the mostly empty lineups during the war, and while Simmons had nothing to do with their banter and roughhousing and endless sex talk, Simmons never married and apparently never dated. He nonetheless became an accepted fixture in the water. A few younger surfers even befriended him. Simmons had a car, after all, and knew how to mix kerosene into his weekly war-rationed supply of gas so as to get every last mile out of the road trip. Simmons did an informal board-making apprenticeship under Guard Chapin, an older surfer who was just as prickly, but louder and more aggressive. Before the war, Chapin was arguably the most progressive surfer in the state, having developed a technique where he'd drop his back knee to the deck of his board and use the lower center of gravity for added turning leverage. His line of attack was so much higher and sharper than that of his peers that he often made a slanting pass across their wakes, shouting curses the entire time. A carpenter by trade and one of the coast's finest boardmakers, Chapin invited Simmons to his Hollywood workshop in 1945, and the two worked on surfboards together after hours. Nothing too radical, often just reshaping redwood blanks. Simmons became one of a tiny number of shapers working in the Los Angeles area, or anywhere on the coast for that matter. Surfers began to look him up. In 1946, Simmons bought a copy of Lindsay Lord's Naval Architecture of Planing Hulls, a daunting 300-page technical manual filled with graphs, tables, and equations on hydrodynamics and structural mechanics. Lord, a naval engineer and architect, was interested in building faster, more maneuverable boats, but Simmons knew that much of the planing hulls would apply to surfboards, and he kept the book near at hand, Quran-like, at all times. With this, Simmons advanced from board-making tradesman to full-fledged designer. Other board makers owned planing hulls, but no one else could really make heads or tails of it. Simmons liked to deepen their bafflement with long, flat-voiced orations on aspect ratios, chord values, and Bernoullian flow. "It was all over my head," Dale Valesey recalled with a shrug, adding, "and who gives a shit anyway?" Thus making the case for all shapers past and present who work more by intuition than calculation. Simmons had a low opinion of the hollow boards, which he dismissively referred to, regardless of use, as paddleboards. The plank design was better, he thought, but not by much. Both had blocky rails and a perfectly flat deck. Hull design was never really considered. All boards were similar in this regard, marginally thicker in the middle than at the bow and stern, creating a soft nose-to-rail curve along the bottom surface. An advantage the plank had over the hollow, Simmons noted, was that it could be stripped and reshaped. Keel-shaped fins were now in use, meanwhile, the one big improvement from a decade earlier. As for the Hawaii-developed hot curl board, California surfers, Simmons included, thought it was a sinker, not floaty enough, and left it alone. Planing holes made note of two new building materials, a silica-based filament cloth called fiberglass and polyester resin. These were used in combination. Resin-saturated fiberglass, squeegeed on most surfaces, dried to become a light, strong, durable, waterproof shell. Both products were invented during the 1930s, but it took wartime development before they had commercial rollout. Development included a bit of industrial espionage, as British spies stole the latest and best resin formulas from Germany and passed them over to the Americans. Simmons was greatly interested in fiberglass and resin. When he and Chapin began putting Lord's book to use on surfboards, the first thing they did was strengthen the tips of their boards, always the first place for dings and cracks, with a layer of Owens Corning fiberglass and Bakelite resin. It took more than a year for the board makers to take the next obvious step and glass the entire board, top to bottom, front to back. Simmons and Chapin eventually had a falling out. By late 1947, the younger surfer was working alone, first out of the family garage in Pasadena, and later in a single-room industrial zone workshop in Santa Monica. By then, Simmons was obsessed with the still-new branch of oceanography called wave science. He realized that to produce a better board, he needed a better understanding of the dynamic medium it would be used in. He visited Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego to pore over stacks of Navy-related research papers, becoming the first surfer with systematic knowledge of wave formation and interval, swell decay, and how incoming swells respond to points, shoals, and reefs. The more he learned, the more Simmons appreciated just how much was being asked of a surfboard. It had to perform at speeds ranging from 0 to 30 miles per hour, on a surface that at any given moment could be flat, canted, or convex, solid or churned, glassy, rilled, or chopped. It needed to grip one moment, then go slippery on the next. On a medium big day of surf, a board might be ridden on waves ranging in size from 3 to 10 feet, and the difference between the two in terms of speed and power was huge. Tom Blake had always kept a few boards at the ready, believing that different conditions required different equipment. But for the majority, carrying multiple boards was neither practical nor popular. Most surfers, as a rule, had just one. Simmons began adjusting the prevailing design components, length and width, rocker, the nose-to-tail curve as viewed from the side, foil, nose-to-tail thickness, weight, rail curve, fin shape, and placement, to see how each variable affected speed, bite, and maneuverability. More often than not, change to a single feature rippled out and affected all the others. Flatten the bottom curve for speed, and the board rode long because it had more planing surface on the water. Reduce the fin size to increase responsiveness, and the narrow tail started to lose grip. Things were made even more complicated by the fact that handmade boards were impossible to duplicate. A 16-inch variation along the hull, or an undetectable low spot in the rail line, or an ounce of extra resin in the finish coat, any little thing, and the copy board rode differently than the original. Board makers, in other words, never had a dependable baseline. Simmons nonetheless attacked furiously with numbers and formulae. As it turned out, solving the design complexity inherent to surfboards was for the moment beyond applied science alone, and the craft would long continue to be a mixture of both art and engineering. But Simmons was right to take a more analytic approach. Not least among his accomplishments was the idea that surfboard specs and dimensions should be carefully measured, noted, and logged. For all the long theoretical flights of fancy and endless hand-scribbled calculations, Simmons' design goals were pretty straightforward: more speed and a longer ride, which was mostly a function of speed. Turns and maneuvers weren't important to him, except as a means to draw a higher line on the wave, which would allow him to go faster. Simmons didn't so much want to ride the wave as skim pelican-like over it. His first big design change, in an effort to cut down on purling, was to scarf join a block of balsa wood to the front end of a new board, which allowed him to shape a few crucial inches of kick into the nose. Because the added wood wasn't just foiled and blended into the deck, but also concaved across the top, Simmons' board had a spoon-like appearance. Simmons' spoon quickly became a common expression among California surfers. It was thought that a raised prow would push water and slow down the board, but that wasn't the case. Once a surfer was up and riding, the board's nose generally hovered a few inches above the surface. When it did drop to sea level, the extra lift was a godsend, as it often kept the board up and running instead of nosing under. Simmons also tapered, thinned, and rounded out the rails, nose to tail, again with the idea of increasing the board's slipperiness. Deck design wasn't as important, Simmons believed, but he had added a slight crown anyway, thinking that it might help keep water flowing to the rear. Most of Simmons' boards were gently convex along the bottom, but he experimented with concaves, intending to further reduce friction by putting a cushion of air between board and wave. Also, the bottom surface was turned up slightly as it moved off the tail, which, combined with the nose lift, gave the Simmons board an early version of rocker. Tom Blake's design instincts had led to a longer, narrower, more pointed craft. The Simmons board, in contrast, was short and wide, with a crescent-shaped nose, parallel rails, and a roomy, squared-off tail. Simmons' own small-wave model was 8 feet by 24 inches. He believed that a broader tail was key to higher speeds, but the added surface led to spin-out, sliding ass to use an old Hawaiian phrase. To solve this, Simmons created the twin-fin board. Instead of the standard center-anchored keel, he put a 5-inch half-moon fin near each corner of the tail. Simmons also continued to experiment with materials. Balsa was hard to find during and just after the war, but it remained the board maker's wood of choice. Roughly half of the 200 boards Simmons built between 1947 and 1950 were solid balsa, wrapped in fiberglass. Each weighed about 40 pounds, 10 pounds less than the average post-war blank. Solid balsa is kind of a misnomer. Board makers glued together several 12-foot pieces of 4-inch by 6-inch balsa to make a rectangular blank from which the board was templated and cut. All balsa boards were made before the war, but the varnish finish cracked and leaked as the soft wood beneath was dented. Fiberglass solved the problem. Simmons also made about 100 of what he called sandwich boards, starting with a lightweight rectangular core of polystyrene foam, better known by its trademark name, Styrofoam, which was another multi-purpose war-developed industrial product. He covered each side with a pattern-cut piece of plywood, bracketed this sandwich with a pair of solid balsa rails, glued it all together using a complicated hand-tightened clamping frame, then fiberglassed the whole thing. Originally, his goal was lightness, but after getting one of his boards down to 20 pounds, Simmons changed his mind and went back to the all-balsa boards, believing the added weight gave the board more stability at higher speeds. There were other drawbacks. Apart from being difficult to make, sandwich boards were notoriously flimsy. You'd go out surfing, a Malibu local recalled. Come in, stand the board up against the wall or something, and the thing would just spring apart in the heat of the sun. The Simmons board came without a logo, stamp, builder's signature, or decorative touch of any kind, and its craftsmanship was only passable. Next to the elegant multi-wood laminated planks made a decade earlier by Pacific System Homes, or the sleek mahogany hollows made by Robert Mitchell Company, Simmons boards looked raw, if not flat-out crude. The builder himself couldn't have cared less. Engineered speed was all Simmons cared about. The rest was frippery. Simmons believed that by way of rigorous calculation and applied science, he'd taken surfboard designs from well-intentioned primitivism into the age of reason. Crowing to his less enlightened fellows on the beach, Simmons would introduce his latest model as a hydrodynamic planing hole. In a more playful mood, he'd simply call it my latest machine. But did the boards actually work? That depended on who was writing. On a long straight line, they were the fastest things in the water. And for a few dozen speed-obsessed Southern California surfers during the late 1940s and 1950s, Simmons was nothing less than a board-making messiah. But a Simmons board was as limiting in its own way as a rocket car tearing across the Bonneville salt flats. Maneuverability would soon be performance surfing's main goal, and better turning meant the surfer not only had to occasionally sink the board's tail into the water, but ride closer to the curl in order to better tap the wave's power. Both ideas disgusted Simmons. Surfboards, he believed, were meant to ride as high out of the water as possible, and the speed line he followed often took him 20 yards out ahead of the curl. The Simmons board also had a pokey look, with its rounded baby rattle nose, ungainly width, and rough-hewn appearance. What was wrong with the glossy finish? Maybe even a color or two. As California's post-war generation of surfers took shape, many wanted their boards to be functional and look sharp. Because of Simmons, boards were lighter and stronger than they'd ever been. The rails were now beautifully rounded, and bottom curves were in play. Innovation had replaced stasis in the board design. Otherwise, Simmons was out of step with the times. As one of his peers remarked, Simmons thought that everyone should ride the way he did. This arrogance kept him from making an even bigger mark in surfboard design. Limited by his injured arm and a narrow view of performance surfing, Simmons rode in the same point-and-shoot riding style that defined the previous generation, except he went half again faster. Simmons moved to San Diego in 1950 to finish college, and he cut way back on his board making. In late September 1954, he and a few other surfers paddled into a rough swell at a La Jolla break called Wind and Sea. After about an hour, Simmons was pitched off his board on a 10-footer, came up bleeding from a cut on his head, and was last seen doing his crabbed one-armed side stroke toward the beach. His twin-fin board washed around near the shore a few minutes later, and a group of kids ran down and pulled it out of the water. Simmons never came in. 3 days later, a lifeguard discovered his body, mottled and eyeless, floating in the shorebreak about a mile to the south. Simmons' legacy was built in part on his death. It's bending the truth to say that he went down in pursuit of a better surfboard, but only a little bit, and his dramatic final act helped make him the embodiment of a dramatic period in surfing's history. Even before Simmons died, a younger crew of Los Angeles shapers had in fact already pushed the design wheel in another direction, one that had an equal or greater bearing on future board making. Yet for a long time afterward, they were all grouped together as Simmons acolytes. The guy who caught everyone's attention was the doomed antisocial genius. Fair or not, the other post-war board makers had to live in Simmons' shadow. Turn, turn, turn. The girl boards. Simmons wanted to ground the entire board-making process in numbers and equations, but it didn't work that way. Improved surfboard design in the post-war years was advanced just as much by luck and providence, even romance. Young Santa Monica surfer designers Joe Quigg and Matt Kivlin also floated breakthrough boards into the lineup during the late 1940s and early 1950s. But these weren't so much prototypes as valentines. Shorter, thinner, lighter all-balsa girl boards originally made more or less on a whim for surfers' sweethearts, then quickly hijacked after the guys discovered how much fun they were to ride. In 1947, Joe Quigg was 1 year out of the Navy and a GI Bill photography student at Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles. He was also a weekend board maker. No other 22-year-old in the state had as much surfing experience. Quigg had made himself a bellyboard at age 4 and had been riding waves ever since. He was a solid performer, especially in the bigger stuff, and was already earning a reputation as a first-rate craftsman. It might take a few weeks, months even, to get a Joe Quigg surfboard, but each one was a thing of beauty. Matt Kivlin was then 18. He'd been surfing for just 4 years. Virtuoso surfer board maker Pete Peterson of Santa Monica had pushed Kivlin into his first wave and been a mentor by example. But the older guys returning from the war immediately recognized him as the hottest young rider on the coast. In the mid-40s, Kivlin had gone wave hunting a few times with Simmons, and not long after Quigg returned from the service, he and Kivlin joined forces with Simmons to make a run of sandwich boards. The partnership quickly failed, mostly over design issues, but also because of differences in temperament. Quigg and Kivlin were friendly and good-looking, smooth and sociable. Kivlin had a reputation for throwing the best beach parties in LA County, and if he was more popular with the honeys than Quigg, it was by the tiniest of margins. The solitary Simmons, meanwhile, glowered across the beachfront like a resin-stained Diogenes. In the summer of 1947, Quigg got a board request from Tommy Zane, his best friend and fellow Navy veteran. Zane had just started dating Darylyn Zanuck, the tiny blonde 17-year-old daughter of 20th Century Fox mogul Dara Zanuck. Zane asked Quigg to make a board small and light enough for Darylyn to load herself into the back seat of her new Chrysler Town & Country convertible and drive up to Malibu. Quigg visited a half-dozen lumberyards to find the lightest possible wood, and a week later he handed Zane a 10-foot, 2-inch, 40-pound redwood and balsa square tail, lifted slightly on both ends and gently curved on the rail line from nose to tail, with egg-shaped rails. The whole idea was to ease the learning process for a 100-pound teenage girl. Each feature was designed to make the board as forgiving as possible. Zane presented the board to Darylyn, borrowed it and returned it, then borrowed it again, and eventually didn't bother to give it back. Dave Rocklin, another easygoing Santa Monica surfer vet, rode the board and liked it as well. So did 34-year-old surf hero Pete Peterson. Nobody really wanted to admit they liked it. When borrowed, the Darylyn board, by unspoken protocol, had to be used in a kind of bluff, grinning, throwaway manner. It was okay to play around with your girlfriend's board on a slow afternoon when the surf wasn't blown out. Serious wave riding, though, that was still done on bigger, heavier, man-sized equipment. The following year, after Zane and Zanuck broke up, ownership of the 10-foot, 2-inch board became an issue. Darylyn, remembered fondly by Quigg as the first girl to buy a surfboard, stick it in the back of her car, and drive up and down the coast learning how to surf, finally had to break into Zane's garage and steal her own board back. These promising, if gender-fraught, board developments were put on hold in the fall of 1947 as Quigg, Kivlin, Zane, and Rocklin all sailed to Hawaii. Each surfer brought along a wide, straight-railed, fiberglass Simmons-style board with either 1 or 2 fins. Waikiki's best surfers were still riding finless, spear-shaped hot curls coated in varnish instead of fiberglass. The Hawaiians weren't impressed by the visitors' boards, which were a bit skittery in the large, more powerful island surf. When Quigg and his friends returned to Los Angeles in mid-1948, however, they immediately began to incorporate some Hawaiian features into their new boards, slimming the template and pulling in the nose and tail. Not too much, because the weaker California surf was better tapped using a bit more surface area, but the new boards were at least 2 inches narrower than what Simmons was making, and that alone was enough to set off a regional design schism. Simmons and his straight-railed, unidirectional machines on one side, and the younger, Quigg-led boardmakers on the other. In the late 1940s, Quigg made the first in his Pintail series, where the aft rails were drawn together like a pencil point, after dreaming about a rocket-shaped board fast enough to deliver him in a blur of speed from the top of the point at Rincon, California's best winter break, 300 yards down the coast on Highway 1. The Hot Curl was already enshrined as the first big wave board. Quigg's Pintail series brought a new level of sophistication and craftsmanship to this specialized field in board design. Not until 1950 did Quigg turn his attention back to the kind of smaller, lighter performance board that he'd made 3 years earlier for Darylyn Zanuck. A new group of high school girls were on the scene. Aggie Bain and Robin Grigg, both 16, met Quigg and Kivlin on the beach in Santa Monica. Bain developed a huge crush on Quigg and decided to have a party and invite all the local surfers. The mixing and flirting continued through the winter and early fall, and just before school let out for summer vacation, a handful of girls all placed orders at once for new startup boards. Quigg made one for Bain, their shotgun wedding followed a few months later, and her friend Vicky Flaxman. Kivlin was a half step behind Quigg as a craftsman, but he worked a lot faster, and he made boards for Robin Grigg, Diane Griffith, and Claire Cassidy. The boards were all 9 feet long, with more rocker and a narrower profile than the still circulating Darlin 10-footer, and by carefully picking only the lightest balsa, Quigg and Kivlin trimmed the weight down to 25 pounds. After each board was shaped, but before it was glassed, the owner would paint her name in big letters across the deck. From then on, each board was known by its moniker, the Vicky board, the Di board, the Aggie board, and so on. These new girl boards were the prototypes for what would soon be called the Malibu Chip. Thin, nose-lifted, yellow-beige, and covered in paraffin wax for traction, they looked like giant greasy potato chips. Quigg and Kivlin, for the most part, kept their boards plain. It was Dave Rocklin, boardmaker to Peter Laughlin and other Hollywood-connected Malibu colony habitués, and future founder of the Baggy Leg Jams line of surf trunks, who began finishing his boards with bright colors and designs. These latest Malibu surfers were the daughters, sisters, and nieces of women who'd put on work pants and shot rivets at Lockheed, Douglas, and the Long Beach Naval Shipyard, and they arrived in their teenage years with a certain proto-feminist swagger. They were nice upper-middle-class girls, but they cursed and drank, smoked cigarettes, and often drove too fast. They were never going to be dilettante wave riders, as nearly all previous female surfers had been over the past 50-plus years, propped up ornamentally on the nose of their boyfriends' boards. The Malibu girls had their own equipment, and by the fall of 1950, after just a few months' practice, they had collectively advanced from beginner to high intermediate, while Flaxman and Cassidy were riding better than most of the men. Quigg and Kivlin loved having the girls in the water and often rode with them side by side, shouting encouragement. But there was the occasional eruption of male resentment, especially from a thick-chested 20-year-old Golden Gloves fighter named Buzzy Trent, and from Bob Simmons, who began his rides from farther up the point at Malibu than anyone, and made it clear while barreling across that he wouldn't hesitate to mow down any or all of the distaffed newcomers. Vicky Flaxman never beefed with Simmons, and was even tempered by nature, but she was a broad-shouldered, 150-pound surfing Amazon, and if someone cut her off on a wave, then smirked about it afterwards, she would paddle up, shove him into the water, lean over and growl, "Don't you ever, ever take off in front of me again." The only surfers who improved at a similar rate was Flaxman and Cassidy. The only surfers who improved at a similar rate as Flaxman and Cassidy were the guys who, once again, began shuffling up and asking to borrow their boards. Kivlin and a 19-year-old New York transplant named Les Williams were the two best surfers at Malibu, and they couldn't keep their hands off the Di board and the Aggie board. By 1951, it was becoming obvious that the same lighter, smaller board design that had made learning so much easier for schoolgirl neophytes was also going to raise the high-end performance standard. Any lingering doubts about the propriety of a man riding a girl's board didn't last much longer. The most macho guys on the beach, Quigg later said, all had one by that summer. This shift marked the start of what would be called the Malibu style of riding. During their Waikiki trip, Quigg and Kivlin had been inspired by Rabbit Kakai, the era's quickest surfer. As Kivlin recalled, all of a sudden it became really important who could turn the best, and the new boards opened the door for turning. They rode smoothly to begin with. 10 years earlier, in order to maintain any directional control at all, plank riders had to stand near the tail, and the unweighted front end would pitch and yaw as it came across any surface bump. The chip allowed the surfer to ride near the center, which kept the board on a much quieter track. Further, the new board didn't just hold an angle. By leaning over one rail or the other and applying pressure, the surfer could now drive a few degrees up and down the wave face. Williams, in particular, took advantage of the new mobility, steering his chip into one bank turn after the other, and then, as the wave flattened out, muscling the nose around until he was actually riding against the grain, a move soon known as a cutback. Kivlin's approach was reserved by comparison. He used a narrow stance, like the old plank riders. But where past masters like Tom Blake and Pete Peterson tried to keep the hips, chest, and shoulders turned forward, almost in a skiing style, Kivlin positioned his feet and body plumb along the board's centerline. It was a more asymmetrical way of riding, but it somehow felt more rooted, and all of the Malibu locals were soon doing it this way. Surfers were now distinguished as left foot forward regular foots and right foot forward goofy foots. Turns were a big deal to Kivlin, but he never changed directions on a wave with attacking glee the way Williams did. Kivlin was a dancer, knees bent, shoulders loose, left arm dropped below the waist, right hand extended smoothly to hip level or above as a balancing mechanism. Williams was hot. Kivlin was cool, so cool in fact that he became modern longboarding's sui generis stylist. One Malibu surfer described Kivlin's method as performance cruising, which perhaps had a double meaning. As Joe Quigg explained, Kivlin surfed the way he did mostly to impress a beach full of female admirers. Matt had quite a following, Quigg said, and when you bring women into the picture, it affects riding style. The Malibu Chip was first and foremost a better riding board, but it was also a touchstone for a group of surfers who helped to change the sport's disposition. In the hands of people like George Freeth, Tom Blake, Bob Simmons, and even Pete Peterson, surfing at times looked to be the province of loners and misfits. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and they helped give the still new sport its own particular energy and independence. But Joe Quigg, Matt Kivlin, Tommy Zane, Dave Rockland, and the rest of the Malibu Chip innovators were closer in spirit to Duke Kahanamoku. They smiled their way through the whole process, from designing boards to wave riding. They were sociable. They opened things up to girls and beginners and managed the difficult trick, rarely achieved in decades to come, of presenting the sport as both cool and friendly. Malibu Magic. Why did Southern California give birth to a national surfing craze? One simple, attractive, ahistorical, quasi-magical explanation is that modern surfing conjured itself into existence from the perfect air that hung over the beach next to the perfect waves at Malibu. Surfing actually made Malibu, but from the 1940s to the early 1960s, it often seemed to be the other way around. Malibu wasn't so much a surfing location as it was a small, intimate, well-designed surfing theater. At Waikiki, and to a lesser degree at San Onofre, both still popular surfing locations, but fading in importance, waves were scattered across a diffuse tract of reef, and the adjacent beach, except for being a staging area, had nothing to do with the surf. At Malibu, the waves were focused and defined, and all but married to the beach, each one rolling in as if it had traveled halfway across the Pacific for the express purpose of gliding into this quarter-mile bit of shoreline. No surf break then or now has ever presented itself so well. The Pacific Coast Highway hugs the coast roughly 20 feet above sea level, so that northbound surfers delivered to the base of the point have a squared-up and slightly elevated view of the incoming waves. The Santa Monica Mountains slope down to the highway, and in the mornings, as offshore winds move through the canyons and across the beach, the lineup smells like sage. Malibu Pier frames the setting to the southeast, and the break is connected to Malibu Lagoon a few hundred yards to the north by a long, sandy cove. The point itself was formed by an ancient geologic burp that sent thousands of cobblestones spilling out of Malibu Creek into the ocean, where they formed a long, evenly curved alluvial fan. Sand transported from north to south by the prevailing littoral current, then blanketed and further stabilized the point. Because the water depth just offshore is relatively deep, and because there are few major underwater landmass obstructions between Malibu and the wave-producing storms to the southwest, waves here generally approach in smooth, even bands. A 6-footer will start breaking north of the lagoon, run for a while, section off, run again, section again, then move into a zone just down from the creek mouth, where the point bends almost due east. An impressive if somewhat temperamental wave so far, here it wraps itself into the cove, better known as First Point, and becomes the faultless Malibu wave of legend, the curl unspooling for 200 yards with a crest line so precise and well tapered that it looks surveyed. The Chumash Indians living on the river mouth named their village Humaliwo, or Loud Surf, but the Malibu surf isn't especially large, for reasons having to do in part with the break's position on the coast. California picks up surf all year, but individual spots are generally oriented in such a way as to either favor incoming swells ranging from north to west, the result of North Pacific winter storms, or from south to southwest, mostly originating in the South Pacific or from tropical gales off Baja California. Winter surf breaks are best from November to March, when the biggest swells can hit 20 feet or more. Malibu and the rest of the summer breaks are best from May to September, when the surf is roughly half as big as it is during the winter. 2 to 4 foot waves are common in Malibu. 6 to 8 foot surf arrives just a handful of days each year, and 12-foot surf is almost unheard of. Size, though, has never been the point of Malibu. Shape and form and elegance. These were the qualities that made it surfing's first truly revered break. Waikiki was filled with excellent waves, and Hawaii in general was still considered the surfer's paradise. But Malibu was the place surfers had in mind in the 1950s when they began talking about the perfect wave. Malibu, the Spanish pronunciation and spelling of Humaliwo, was also the first forbidden wave since Hawaiian chiefs of antiquity had called down a kapu to clear the surfing rabble from their favorite breaks. When Malibu pioneers Tom Blake and Sam Reed drove out of Santa Monica in 1927, boards wedged into the rumble seat of Blake's Roadster, they were stopped 2 miles from Malibu Point by a locked wooden fence. They didn't mind paddling the last 2 miles up the coast to Malibu, and Reed later claimed that the experience of riding his first Malibu wave made him feel noble in spirit. But neither of them rushed back. Too many waves simply peeled off ahead of them. Steering their board into the necessary tight angle was just about impossible. Pacific Coast Highway opened Malibu to the public in 1929, and Depression-era surfers visited now and then, but the break was still thought of as a bit too hot. John "Doc" Ball and his Palos Verdes Surf Club gang drove up, but not often. Waves here are fast and crack down like dynamite, Ball wrote in his book California Surf Riders, which featured 32 photos of San Onofre and just 2 of Malibu. A surf break becomes famous when it can advance the cause faster than any other break. Malibu wasn't the right spot for the 20s or 30s, but it was made to order for the post-war progressives who first wanted to ride on a higher, faster line and then wanted to swoop up and down across that line. Simmons, Quigg, Kivlin, the hot California shapers all made their boards with Malibu in mind. The Aggie board and the Dai board and the rest of the girl boards were launched at First Point. Les Williams did his first bank turn here. Simmons claimed that on a particularly long-walled overhead Malibu wave, he hit a kind of terminal velocity when his machine lifted up and for a moment or two skimmed above the water surface, then touched down and sent him into a pinwheeling wipeout. Malibu was the test track, recalled boardmaker Dale Velzy. I'd paddle out and see a guy on one of my boards just buried in the curl. And first of all, it was just a beautiful sight, but also I could watch and see how the board was working. Look at that rail, it's really biting in, that kind of thing. Famous surf breaks are often a challenge to ride well, but from the 1940s on, that was never the case at Malibu. Everybody looked good surfing there, Velzy said. It was always a very kind wave. Just like at Waikiki and San Onofre, Malibu changed the sport on the land as well as in the water. This sandy hook of beachfront would in fact be surf culture's last and greatest site-specific incubator. Loose-fitting clothes, bouncy slang, pride in the sport's detachment from other sports, and the insolence that comes with that pride, a default wariness towards other surfers, brief public nudity, and other forms of social rebellion. Much of the surfer's style book was drafted at Malibu beginning in 1945. In many respects, it was like San Onofre, but with much better surf. Malibu was just far enough removed from Southern California's suburban reach to make being there an unsupervised, semi-private, easily accessed adventure. There were no lifeguards. There was no local police force. Malibu was decades away from incorporating as a city. There were no commuters to drive by and see a gang of plainly fit young men and women gathered together daily in the coastal version of hanging out on a street corner. This distance, 10 miles up the coast from Santa Monica, which was then the northwestern edge of Los Angeles' beachfront suburbs, helped forestall by nearly a decade the general public's disapproving view of surfing and surfers. It also helped that the break at Malibu was located within the established sphere of leisure that surrounded Malibu Colony, the famous Hollywood bedroom community just to the north. The whole point of Malibu was to put the Santa Monica Mountains between yourself and the rest of Los Angeles. After the war, there was a new readiness among wave riders to live an unadulterated version of the surfing life. Pre-war surfers, to one degree or another, had all hedged their bets. Pete Peterson, no doubt, would have described himself in the 30s as a lifeguard who surfed. Tom Blake was forever trying to align wave riding with paddling and rescue work. Surfing by itself didn't seem to be enough. Or maybe it was, but pre-war surfers weren't yet comfortable admitting it to themselves and the world at large. At Malibu, after the war, this reluctance to fully embrace the sport as a reason for living in and of itself vanished, particularly for those American surfers who had enlisted and served in the military. "We spent 4 or 5 years in the war," Malibu surfer Dave Rocklin explained, "and it had all been bad. When the war ended, boom, we were back on the beach. It was devotion, like I'm never going to leave. We gave ourselves over to it entirely." Extracurricular surf-related activities were trimmed back. The associations with paddleboarding and lifeguarding remained, but were less important. In a complete turnaround from the 1930s, surfers no longer showed much interest in organizing the sport through clubs or competitions. Wave riding, along with endless association with fellow surfers, could stand up, could in fact flourish, without support structures or formal organizations. At this point, surfing had been part of Southern California's recreational landscape for 40 years. It had its own history and was beginning to take on the heft of permanence, which likely helped the Malibu surfers make a bigger commitment to the sport. Then again, the stakes had been raised. Lounging on the beach was a harder act to justify during the post-war prosperity boom than it had been during the Depression. In 1937, you could ride waves for hours a day because there wasn't really much else to do. In 1947, serious water time was paid for with reduced paychecks and a much shortened list of job choices. For a lot of surfers, this was a fair trade. They waited tables, worked as lifeguards, fished, or learned how to milk a GI Bill stipend, anything to stay on the beach. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, surf rebellion, if it could even be called that, was quiet and friendly. For Quigg and Rocklin, and another 24 post-war Malibu regulars and hangers-on, the surf experience was often pursued as if it were an extended vacation with friends and family. Lots of beer and wine, parties and get-togethers, some horseplay, and the occasional brawl. It had a pre-rock and roll cadence, just what you'd expect from a small 50s community in which the teenagers were led by a core of older surfers who'd been overseas, served in the war, and in some cases even got married. They built hot new boards. They put surfing closer to the center of existence than any group before them, and for their efforts, they were all but erased over the following decade by a golden horde of suburban teenage newcomers who would spread out across the beach and the lineup at Malibu by the thousands. Dale Velzy and the Pig. The Malibu of popular legend was mostly created by 4 surfers: Dale Velzy, Dewey Weber, Terry Tracy, and Mickey Dora. 3 were from broken families. Tracy and Weber attended junior college, but to no real purpose. They were mostly beach educated. All 4 were entertainers. All 4, to varying degrees, were hustlers. They commuted to Malibu. With just 1 or 2 exceptions, none of the break's best-known riders were actually Malibu residents. And by 1953, they'd become First Point regulars, just as Quigg and Kivlin and the rest of their original post-war Malibu crew were ready to move on. Dale Velzy became the defining mid-50s boardmaker. He was the oldest of the new group, a grinning, tattooed former merchant marine and part-time pool shark from Hermosa Beach, who loved hot rods and horses nearly as much as he loved to surf. Everyone wanted to pal around with Velzy. He occasionally rode with a notorious booze fighters motorcycle gang, but was just as comfortable having drinks on the veranda with British actor and sophisticate David Niven. Velzy and Niven surfed together often in Waikiki during the early 50s. He was always using the word splendid, Velzy later recalled. He'd say to me, "Oh, that was a splendid wave you just had." And I'd say, "Niven, don't say splendid, say bitchin'. That was a bitchin' wave." Velzy began surfing in 1937 at age 10. He was a wiry and athletic, graceful at times, but more interested in pushing limits. He was likely the first surfer to hang 10, and unquestionably the first to decorate a surfboard with a pair of resined-on black lace panties. When the mood struck, he was also a hard worker. Woodcraft was a Velzy family tradition. His father made chessboards with hand-carved pieces, which were sold at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles, and his cabinet-maker grandfather built the oak casket Teddy Roosevelt was buried in. Velzy himself, after the war, earned enough money as a backyard boardmaker that he decided to try and make a real vocation of it. Velzy rode Malibu often, driving up the coast in his mean-looking, chopped and channeled 1940 Mercury, and knew that Quigg, Simmons, and Kivlin had all the beaches in northern Los Angeles County pretty well locked up. So Velzy decided to work closer to home in an area called South Bay, which included Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, and Palos Verdes. Barefoot and bare-chested, using a pair of sawhorses and his grandfather's tools, he worked beneath Manhattan Pier in 1949 until city officials noticed the wood shavings fanning out across the beach and shut the operation down. Undeterred, Velzy rented a tiny storefront just up from the pier. He had a two-tone, designed by Velzy surfboard logo made, and at age 22 became the owner of the sport's first licensed board-making outlet. From the beginning, business was good. There was always at least a board or two to work on, and in a good week, he and a hired laminator cranked out as many as 10. Rent was $45, each board sold for $55. Velzy ran a strange, stripped-down operation. Future generations of beachgoers, in fact, wouldn't have recognized it as a surf shop at all. There were no shiny new boards lined up on racks, no display cases, no beachwear, no stickers or surf wax, no countertop, telephone, or cash register, not even a storefront sign. "I didn't want people to notice that much," Velzy later said. He had as many orders as he could handle anyway, and thought it was best not to give city inspectors any reason to take interest in his small, dirty, health code violating board-making setup. In 1952, after putting his business on hold for a year to live in Hawaii, Velzy opened a second shop on a beachfront lot just south of Malibu Pier. Simmons was by that time living in San Diego. Quigg would soon move to Honolulu, and Kivlin was about to start working as an architect. Right away, just like in South Bay, Velzy had plenty of work. He also did himself a favor and got his hands on a new chain-driven electric planer, and this big, shrieking, first-generation power tool saved him a lot of time and sweat while hogging out, rough-shaping each glued-up slab of balsa. Not long afterward, a woodworking genius from Waikiki named Abel Gomes designed a router jig for Velzy that allowed him to easily maintain a consistent thickness and rocker from board to board, which was another huge time saver. In 1954, Velzy closed the Malibu operation and opened a shop in Venice, closer to the customer base, with a new partner and fellow South Bay boardmaker, Dudley Hap Jacobs. Velzy had been making Quigg-style chipboards for nearly 5 years, and one afternoon, weary at the thought of another, he instead shaped a board with a narrow nose, continued rail curve, a lowered wide point, and a round tail. It was a funny-looking board, kind of homely with its bulbous rear end. A real pig, Velzy thought, smiling. The pig turned out to be a killer, and the name stuck. Lighter versions weighed in at just over 20 pounds. and the reduced nose area allowed the board to spear through the water with fewer catches and snags and to come around a beat or two faster during turns. To keep the wide tail anchored into the wave face, the pig had an oversized fin, about the size and shape of a croquet wicket, but raked back so that the trailing edge actually stuck out past the board's rear end. Like the chip, only more so, the pig proved that the board speed wasn't just a matter of improved planing, as Simmons believed, but also a function of how well the board handled in and around the pocket, the concave zone just below the curl. This was a tricky place to ride. It was steep and fast-changing and attached to the whitewater, which was then considered nearly unrideable. But the pocket, clearly, was the place to be. Get up there high enough, aim back down, shift forward a little, and it was like releasing a catapult. At Malibu, the Simmons gang on their wide straight-railed boards could make it from the top of the point all the way to the cove. But the young pig riders were now covering half again as much ground by riding up into the pocket, blasting back down, swinging around through the trough, then back up the face and down again, 5 or 6 times in a row before the wave finally gurgled up onto the beach. For good measure, while in trim, they also learned how to shuffle up to the front end, where they'd pose near the tip for a moment or two before retreating back to the sweet spot. Les Williams and a few other chip pioneers had already sketched out the new lines. The pig allowed for an even tighter turning radius. At the dawn of the performance era, this was pretty much all that mattered. By the summer of 1955, the pig was the hottest board on the coast, and the Velzy Jacobs shop in Venice was taking 30 orders a week. The Simmons board was officially obsolete. The chip was on its way out. Pig boards were about to become so commonplace that the name itself would disappear. By 1957, an American surfboard was a pig by default. Well, that's going to do it for part 1 of this 2-part series from Chapter 3 of Matt Warshaw's History of Surfing, Malibu Swing, 1945 to late 1950s. In our next episode, we will continue reading from Chapter 3, starting with Dewey Weber, Mickey Dora, Tube Steak Tracy, and the rest of the Malibu crew, continuing through Malibu Styles' expansion to other countries, the first surf films, and Greg Knoll's Waimea adventures. I hope you'll join us for part 2. And until then, keep your toes on the nose, your bottom turns tight, and your stoke high. I'm Billy Jack, and I'll see you in the lineup. Matt Warshaw is a former professional surfer, surf historian, and is widely regarded as the foremost authority on surf culture. He's best known for The History of Surfing, a richly detailed chronicle that traces the sport from its Polynesian roots to its modern global presence. Warshaw combines deep research with a lifelong love of surfing, bringing clarity, wit, and insight to his work. In addition to The History of Surfing, he's authored several other influential books, including The Encyclopedia of Surfing, a personal favorite, Mavericks, The Story of Big Wave Surfing, Zero Break, an illustrated collection of surf writing, 1777 to 2004, and Photo, Stoner, The Rise, Fall, and Mysterious Disappearance of Surfing's Greatest Photographer. Warshaw's writing serves as a cultural archive, preserving the stories, characters, and moments that have defined surfing across generations. Beyond his books, Warshaw is the creator and curator of the online Encyclopedia of Surfing, a living digital project that continues to document the ever-evolving world of surf. With a sharp eye for detail and deep respect for the sport's heritage, he has dedicated his career to ensuring that surfing's rich and complex story is told, remembered, and celebrated.